Okay, so we are recording, and welcome to the Violence Free Colorado monthly Facts and Snacks webinar. This one is entitled Understanding Domestic Violence Offender Treatment Victim Advocacy, and I will give my little spiel one more time about if you are joining us, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat with your name, your pronouns, your organization, and your role. And if you'd like to share that with everyone, please select all panelists and attendees on the drop-down menu. My name is Brandy, Walega, and I work with Violence Free Colorado as a technical assistance and training specialist. I have worked with survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault for over 21 years in different capacities. And one of those capacities was also working as a treatment victim advocate for about 13 and a half years. So I do know some of the ins and outs, and hopefully I can be a resource for you if you have questions. So, as we move through this presentation today, I encourage you to ask questions. I'm going to keep an eye on the chat box, but I will also pause a couple times so that we have time for questions throughout as well as at the end. So decide if you want to ask questions. Just know that if I'm looking off to the side, it means that I'm looking at the chat box. If I'm looking down, it means I'm looking at my notes. So thank you all for joining me today, and I'm going to go ahead and get started. My little mouse likes to be unruly sometimes. So here's an overview of what we're going to cover today. So we're going to do a quick poll in a minute, and because I'm curious about all the folks in the audience, and I've seen some of that in the chat. So great cross section of folks joining. So thank you all for being here. In terms of overview, so I'm going to cover a lot of little bits of different topics. So we're going to talk really briefly about what DV offender treatment is, who are treatment victim advocates or TVAs. We're going to cover the three different types of advocates in Colorado, and talk about confidentiality with those three types. We're also going to be more specific about the roles and responsibilities of treatment victim advocates, as well as helping survivors connect with TVAs. And I've left a good portion at the end so that we can answer questions. And like I said, I will be checking the chat as we go along to see if there's questions. If I miss anything, I'll make sure we get to it at the end. So I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll. And for those of you, if you're on the phone or if you don't have the capacity to see the poll, I am putting this slide up here. So this is what the poll says. So in terms of accessibility, if you're not able to see the poll when I pop it up, there we go. Launching the poll. If you're able to vote, feel free to do that in the poll. Let me know who's attending today. Are you a community-based DV or SA advocate? Are you a treatment victim advocate? Maybe a DV or SO treatment provider? Another mental health provider? Are you in probation or another supervising authority role? If you're in another role, feel free to type that in the chat if you'd like to. Just leave this open just for a few more seconds. And again, if you're not able to see the poll for any reason, and you can see the slides, feel free to type in the chat your role, and then we can see that as well. All right. I'm gonna give it 5 more seconds. Okay, and we're gonna go ahead and looks like about 95% of folks have voted. And okay, so sharing the results, hopefully you can all see this. Looks like we have 40% of DVSO treatment providers on the webinar today, as well as community-based DVSA advocates, probation supervising authorities, both coming in at 25%. Treatment victim advocates, we have 5%, and another role also at 5%. So thank you all for being here. And I think it's always helpful for us to know who's on a webinar, especially if, again, as we move through these slides today and through conversation today, again, I invite you to ask questions, type them in the chat box. If there's a scenario you want to talk about, we can maybe leave that towards the end. But definitely, want to make sure that we, see what comes up, because there's a lot of questions, I think, that can come up about treatment victim advocacy. Okay, so here is the nitty-gritty overview of domestic violence offender treatment. This is not everything, and I really want to point everyone towards the Colorado Domestic Violence Offender Management Board. I do have their website linked in the end for resources. So the DVOMB, they create standards and guidelines, and the standards for offender treatment are called Standards and Guidelines for the Assessment, Evaluation, Treatment, and Behavioral Monitoring of Domestic Violence Offenders. That's a mouthful, so we often refer to them as the standards. So if I say that, or if someone else refers to the standards, feel free to just remember that's what that means. And in the standards, section 7.0 is the section within the standards that talks about treatment victim advocates. So a couple things that are really important to remember, and again, this isn't pointed towards any population in particular, it's just good reminders about what we know about offender treatment. So DV offender treatment is not 36 or 52 weeks anymore. So for quite a while now, we've had differentiated treatment levels. So there's 3 levels for offenders, either A, B, or C, and C is the highest level. And it's based on risk. So there's going to be different requirements at each level. And as I mentioned, the DVOMB has a lot of great resources on their website, and they also provide free trainings in terms of talking about the standards, working through different things about learning about risk, learning about measuring that, and how it all works. So I encourage you all to check that out because it's a great resource. So when we think about offender treatment, really the primary goals are cessation of abusive behaviors and victim and community safety. So there's always tons of other goals happening, but that's the umbrella. That's the umbrella that all of this operates under. So also in offender treatment, there's focus on competencies. And in terms of competencies, there's a bunch of them. There's general ones, and then there's also going to be individualized treatment goals for each offender. So it's just important to be aware for all of the people who might be affiliated with offender treatment to understand what those competencies are, what are those, what are the things being measured for each person, both collectively and individually. So when we think about offender treatment as a team, and so there's a multidisciplinary treatment team called the MTT, and at a minimum, that includes the offender treatment provider, the supervising authority, maybe parole or probation, and the treatment victim advocate. However, more folks can be a part of that team. So maybe someone is in substance use treatment, so maybe that provider might be on the MTT. Maybe CPS is involved in the MTT. There's a lot of opportunity to be involved in terms of who feels comfortable being part of that treatment team for that offender. And it's also really helpful to understand all of the working pieces and parts. We're not one-dimensional beings. Offenders aren't either. And so really looking at that in terms of all the different layers. And MTTs, they make decisions as a team. So some of those decisions include like what level, A, B, or C, they're going to be in. Treatment plan reviews, how are things going throughout the process of treatment, if there's any change in treatment level, or if there's if it's time to prepare for discharge. So those are examples of some of the decisions that an MTT makes. And again, this is just the surface. So if you have other questions, you want to learn more about offender treatment, definitely check out the DVOMB website because they have tons and tons of information. So one other thing I also say is that, I'm hoping that this is quite obvious, but I'm going to say it anyway, is that, when I'm using the word offender, that language mirrors the language that's in the standards, the treatment standards. And it's referring to the person who has chosen to use abusive behaviors. So if you attend other webinars that are sponsored or put on by Violence Free Colorado, we might use different language depending upon the context. And so I just wanted to put that out there. I should have said that earlier, but just so that we're all on the same page. So who are TVAs? So just the tip of the iceberg, I think that it's important to recognize that there's not one category that treatment victim advocates might fit into. Some of them actually might work directly for an offender treatment agency or a treatment provider. They might be directly employed. Some of them might be independent contractors, so they could serve one or more DV treatment provider. And that might be in more than one county or more than one jurisdiction. It really just depends upon that individual who's providing the TVA services. In terms of, there's not any guide, there's no rule that someone can only work for one treatment provider, or as long as, they've met their qualifications, they can decide how they want to operate. And so for some, that might mean that they're just doing TVA work if that's how they can if that's their choice around their work. Some folks also might work for community-based advocacy organizations. And you'll see my little parenthetical caution here. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but ultimately what it comes down to is if someone's in a community-based advocacy organization and they're doing treatment victim advocacy work, there has to be a lot of boundaries and a lot of clarity around roles, and that's related to confidentiality. So more on that later. And some treatment victim advocates have more than one job. So they might be doing treatment victim advocacy on the side if they have a full-time job and maybe they do it part-time. I'll use myself as an example. That's how I worked. I worked as a community-based advocate for a long time, and then also did some treatment victim advocacy work on the side in a different jurisdiction than I was working as a community-based advocate. So it's important to know that there's not one way that treatment victim advocates might be coming to the table and participating in MTTs or even trying to figure out how to access trainings. I think it can be helpful just to know some of that background. All right, so advocacy just ahead. So one of the things I mentioned in the overview is that there are 3 types of advocates in Colorado. And most of us are going to be mostly familiar with the community-based and system-based advocates, but ultimately there are 3 kinds, and that includes advocacy and DV offender treatment. But I think it's really, really important for us. We're just going to do kind of an overview of the 3 of these, obviously with more focus on TVAs. But it's important to know what survivors and victims might be coming in, who they might be coming into contact with. Survivors are going to, be in different places at different points in time, and that through, if there is a criminal legal process happening, or if there's civil things happening, they can be in different places. So recognizing that all 3 types of these advocates they're going to look a little different. There's going to be variation in the types of services that are provided by each advocate. There's variation in the points of contact for accessing, as well as the availability and eligibility for services, and the levels of confidentiality. So confidentiality is going to be a big one, and we're going to touch on that throughout the rest of the webinar. But keep that in mind, and I definitely encourage you to ask questions if you have them about anything, but also especially about confidentiality. So a little overview, system-based advocacy can look a variety of ways. So advocates who are system-based, they're often in law enforcement roles, or within law enforcement. They're maybe in district or city attorney offices. They might be with probation or parole. Basically, their advocacy is accessed through the criminal legal system. That's how survivors come into contact with them. Whether a case is going to move forward or not, that's the starting point. And sometimes, depending upon the jurisdiction, some advocates who are system-based might be working with survivors of all crimes. They might not just be working with DV or SA or stalking survivors. They might be working with survivors of all crimes. There's no pros or cons to that. It's just more like that's just a fact. They might be called victim specialists or victim service officers. I feel like sometimes our language changes at different points in time. So it's helpful just to kind of know that, one other piece about this is that this is what we know they're called. And when we talk to survivors, ultimately, I think that most survivors talk about advocates in terms of a geographical thing, a geographical kind of point of reference. So like, that's my court advocate, or that's my police advocate, or that's my safe house advocate, or that's so wherever that person, because we have so many victim advocates, right? It can be confusing. Usually survivors are referring to the person wherever they're meeting them, wherever they're having contact. But I think it's also helpful for all of us to know, like, well, what is their actual title? And if you're not sure, you can always ask. In terms of confidentiality, any information shared by a survivor with a system-based advocate, it's not protected or confidential, and it is subject to subpoena. So again, that's something that we all should know and we're aware of. It's just also really important. I bring up these pieces because most survivors aren't going to know these things unless they're dealing with a system, and it's usually dealing with a system for the first time is when they're learning that. So it's important for all of us, no matter what role we're in, to be able to explain the different types of advocacy to survivors so that they can understand where their information might go or not go, what choices do they have about sharing information. So it's just an important piece to keep an eye on. So here's community-based advocacy. So usually community-based advocates are working with organizations providing services for survivors of domestic violence, sex assault, stalking, even human trafficking. Sometimes they're generalized advocates. You know, we typically call them victim advocates, but sometimes they might have a specific role. Maybe they're a civil legal advocate. Maybe they're a housing advocate, or maybe they're an advocate who can, you know, do all of the things, which is also fine. So there's not any one right way to be a community-based advocate or whatever role. And every program around the state, also every domestic violence program around the state that supports survivors, they all have a little bit different structure. And that's usually based on what the community needs are. And you know, it's just important to know that they all don't necessarily work or provide the same services in the same ways. So in terms of community-based advocacy, services are voluntary. There are no requirements. Survivors self-identify and they're screened in, and survivors really guide that process. Whereas systems-based advocates are usually giving survivors information about maybe how a court process might go, or how things are going legally, or what their choices are about participation. The survivor gets to make choices about, in some ways, about what they can participate in or not, whereas in community-based advocacy, they're making choices about all the things, about accessing services, about, you know, what things that they're needing, how do they want to communicate with their advocates. You know, it's definitely survivor driven. And in terms of community-based advocacy, it's a statute mandated privilege. So it's actually written into Colorado statute so that community-based advocates must maintain confidentiality if there's a civil or a criminal case happening, or when survivors don't have any legal involvement, they must always maintain confidentiality. So any questions so far about some of the overview stuff? I know this is probably a lot of review, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page moving forward. Okay, seeing none, we'll keep on motoring through. So treatment victim advocacy. You know, I mentioned earlier about the different ways that TVAs might be employed. And it's also important to know that TVAs don't actually fit. They're not the same as system-based or community-based. They might seem like a little bit of one, a little bit of the other, but they're not exactly like either. And also it's really important to recognize that treatment victim advocates are only outlined in the DV offender treatment standards, and they're not actually listed in the statute. So that's a huge difference when we think about, I have a question in the chat about reviewing the difference between system-based and community-based confidentiality. Thanks, Gail. I will do that when we get to the bottom of this slide. So when we think about, you know, treatment victim advocacy, TVAs exist. They're not in statute currently. They only exist within the DVOMB treatment standards. And that kind of puts them in a unique role. It puts them in a unique role because they don't have the same protections that, for example, a community-based advocate has. And it's also important to recognize that all of the things about treatment victim advocates are written into, you know, 7.0, that whole section. All the standards are important. You should read all of them, and especially 7.0. Recognizing that, you know, all of these pieces are written in, and at the same time, there's not necessarily statutory language to back that up. Excuse me. So when we think about treatment victim advocates, you know, they're providing advocacy specifically to survivors of DV offenders in offender treatment. In terms of the access, you know, survivors get to choose their level of involvement or their level of communication, so that piece is voluntary. Survivors are not required to have an input about offender treatment. It's their right to do so, and they can, but they get to choose whether they want that information as an offender moves through treatment or not. And as we talked about, they're called treatment victim advocates. And in terms of confidentiality, so the way that 7.0 was written and revised a handful of years ago, they have similarity the way that they're written to community-based advocates in terms of mandatory reporting. So this kind of, hopefully this will answer the question in the chat. Community-based advocates, everything that is shared with a community-based advocate is confidential. The exceptions to that are if a survivor chooses to sign a release or an ROI, so release of information, and wants to very specifically share some information, or if there is if there's known or suspected child abuse or neglect, that's the mandatory report that a community-based advocate has to make, or for some court orders. So I say some because, for example, community-based advocates, maybe a subpoena arrives for records. That's something that they can attempt to quash. I'm not here to give you legal advice. It's just something that is known in terms of community-based advocacy that they can attempt to do that because of the protections that we have under Colorado statute for community-based advocates. So in turn, systems advocates, they're confidential. They don't have confidentiality. So like we talked about, like with someone who's in the court system or someone who's in law enforcement as an advocate, anything that's shared with them, that's basically shareable, subpoenaable. It's more considered almost public in a sense because it's shared within the systems. And within systems, there isn't that confidentiality. So if a law enforcement advocate learns something from a survivor, then if that's something they need to report to the detective, then they have to do that. They should tell the survivor as well that they have to do that or that they're going to do that. But that's something that they don't need a release for that. That's just part of how the system works. Where in turn, community-based advocates, they can't share any information about a survivor, again, other than the mandated reporting piece around child abuse. They can't share that without any release. So treatment victim advocates, how do they fit into this? Again, they're really similar. The way that they're written in 7.0, again, there's not a statute that they specifically fall under. So it's written that they also have to do mandatory reporting for child abuse and neglect, but also for elder abuse and at-risk adults, abuse of at-risk adults. So that's what's currently written in 7.0. And again, the confidentiality piece can be kind of tricky. Ultimately, it's not about, I think it's important to remember, it's not about advocates trying to be difficult or trying to, not share information. Not sharing anything that a survivor doesn't want to be shared is the ultimate survivor-centric and trauma-informed way to be. So, recognizing that if information can't be shared, there's probably a good reason. It's also okay, to recognize that it can be frustrating when you're trying to look for information or you're curious about it, if you don't have access to it, and recognizing each type of advocate is going to have different levels of confidentiality. So keep the confidentiality questions coming if they come up. I include this mind the gap because, again, all three advocates, they're all the same. They're all different. They're not all the same. They're all different. However, they do share some things in common, right? Each type of advocate is going to be able to provide resources and referrals to survivors. Each type is going to focus on safety, and each type is really going to be focused on respecting survivors and making sure they're empowered to understand and know their choices and know what's happening in all the processes that are happening. So it's also really important, and I think ethically responsible for each type of advocate to be able to explain what the other types do and what their limits of confidentiality are. Because again, we know that survivors, when they are entering a system, for example, if they're having contact with the criminal legal system, most survivors aren't going to know how that works until they're in it. And when they're in it, they're usually experiencing trauma. And that's not so easy to take in information, right? So recognizing that when each type of advocate knows how the other ones work, they can explain that too. That can be really helpful. So just a little reminder. So we think about treatment victim advocacy. This is also an overview, but if there's other questions that come up, definitely let me know and we'll work through them as we can. So it's important to know with treatment victim advocacy, all members of, let me back up and say all members of the MTT, they all operate under the big umbrella goal that I mentioned earlier, safety for survivors and community, right? But TVAs, they're bringing to the table a specific skill set, a specific perspective about how survivors might be impacted by domestic violence and how safety is fluid and not static. That doesn't mean that other people in the MTT or other members don't know those things. It just means that's the perspective TVAs are bringing. That's their role. So it's also important for all parts of the MTT to really understand all of the ethical and confidential obligations that TVAs have. So as I mentioned, the confidentiality piece, again, it can feel a little confusing sometimes. So one other thing that's important is that when I mentioned earlier, survivors get to choose whether they want communication through offender treatment or not. Maybe they don't want to talk with the TVA. Maybe they don't want any information at all about offender treatment. And that's fine. That's a choice, and that's totally fine. TVAs are going to leave that door open and say, hey, if you change your mind, here's my number, here's my contact information. Let me know if you need something in the future. But even when a survivor doesn't want to have contact with the TVA or doesn't want to share information with the MTT, the TVA's role, the TVA still is part of the MTT. They're not sharing something specific about a specific survivor, but they're bringing that perspective of, overall perspective around safety planning, safety considerations. Is there any problem solving to do through a survivor-centered lens, and sharing, trauma-informed considerations with survivors? So again, even if a specific survivor either isn't present, doesn't want to participate in any way with offender treatment, again, that's fine. Or if they don't want to share information, that's okay too. The TVA is bringing that perspective, kind of being that liaison for survivors within the MTT. So it's also important for TVAs to be able to explain to survivors when they're having communication around, making sure survivors understand where their information might go, what might, who might learn things from that. In terms of sharing information within MTT, for example, TVAs can maybe, let me back up and say, survivors have choices about who they want to share with. So sometimes they might only share with the TVA, right? So that might feel frustrating to the other members of the MTT, because the TVA can't say, this survivor is talking to me or this survivor is not talking to me, because that's the protected piece. So it's important to recognize that even though a TVA can't say that, they're bringing the victim lens and victim perspective to an MTT. And through that lens, again, they can't say, I'm working with this person or not working with this person, or and ultimately though, the survivor might choose, hey, maybe I want just the treatment provider to know this piece of information, because maybe the treatment provider is in groups or sessions with the offender and wants the treatment provider just to know something and to be on the lookout. So maybe they've agreed that the survivor and the TVA agreed the TVA can share a piece of information with the offender treatment provider, and that, again, that's the survivor's choice. And maybe that means that the offender treatment provider is just holding on to that nugget of knowledge and just watching, like, is this coming up? How is this person responding to maybe certain topics that we're talking about in groups? So recognizing that piece, and also a survivor might want to share something with the whole MTT, right? And that's okay too. If they do, it's important that they understand, for example, though, that if sharing information with probation or parole, for example, that is very likely that the offender will eventually learn that information, because we know that's how, ultimately how offenders are held accountable. It's a piece of that work. So, knowing that it's important for TVAs to be able to explain to survivors all of these different pieces of confidentiality. What happens or what could happen if I share information? So sometimes, and I want to be honest about this isn't always like, clean and pretty. Sometimes survivors don't want to share information out of fear for safety, fear for a lot of reasons. So they might know something that's happening even while an offender is going through treatment, and they don't want to share that with the MTT because of fear for many, many reasons. And again, that's also okay. That's important that the TVA and the survivor are talking through those things, making sure that there's safety planning in place, and supporting the survivor around whatever choices that they want to make. I know I can, again, use myself as an example as a TVA. That was something that came up a handful of times for sure. Sometimes a survivor would know, hey, this is happening, but if I share it, that person, the offender, is going to know that I shared it, and that puts me at risk. So I can't share it. So maybe the offender leaves treatment and that piece doesn't come to the surface. Okay, it's not a perfect system. And while the offender's going through treatment, hopefully they're doing, they're working on those competencies. They're working on all the different pieces and can see if something will shift for that offender. But it's really important to recognize that, again, survivors have the ultimate choice around who they want to share their information with. So I want to pause there and see if there's any questions about that piece. I know sometimes it can feel like, oh, well, why would the TVA know something as part of the MTT and not the other folks in the MTT? Again, the TVA's role is to support the survivor. And if a survivor wants a treatment provider, for example, to know a piece, but not probation or parole, then again, that's not, or community corrections, that's not to be mean, that's not to be exclusive. It's all about safety and survivor choice. So, any questions about that? All right, we'll keep going. So, thinking about TVA roles and responsibilities, and it's important that they will be able to explain this to other members of the MTT, explain it to survivors, and also maybe even explain it to other types of advocates, right? TVAs have the goal of offering information. Their goal isn't to be a detective to obtain all the information of, ooh, what's going on, how are all of these things manifesting. It's really about whatever the survivor wants to share. Making sure that survivors understand that they do have the right to know certain things about offender treatment, getting to, that they have the right to know, when does this person attend groups or attend sessions? Because a lot of times when treatment victim advocates are initially reaching out, especially, a lot of times they'll try to do that. Well, and this was back in person, so the COVID caveat. But a lot of times then, it was safer to try to contact a survivor when an offender was in group, because there was that potential buffer time that person maybe wasn't around. Again, a little different when we have the COVID caveat of things, but it's just important to recognize that, TVAs, their roles, and they also have the responsibility to be able to explain those roles. So we talked about confidentiality. They provide support about a variety of things. So it's important for TVAs to be able to explain what the offender treatment process looks like, explain MTT, explain the TVA role, and also offer updates throughout offender treatment, right? So, recognizing that ultimately, again, there's so many different pieces to domestic violence, and we all know it doesn't move in a linear way. So at any given time, there might be a risk change, there might be a safety issue, something might come up. So being able to, offer survivors the choices and the understanding of how this is going, what's working, talking with survivors about general DV dynamics, warning signs, risks. Again, I mentioned ongoing safety planning already. And also, depending upon, so if a TVA is working with an offender treatment provider who is working with what are called in the standard special populations. So if they're working with female identified survivors or survivors who are within the LGBTQIA+ communities, TVAs need to be able to have that training to be able to work with, for example, survivors who identify as male or survivors who identify as part of the LGBTQIA+ communities. So that's a specific piece that we encourage. If a TVA is doing TVA work, then that's also in the standards that we want to make sure TVAs have that training. One other kind of nuance that comes up is that's also written into section 7.0 as a discussion point, I believe, that in terms of responsibility for the TVAs, that again, their goal is to support survivors where they're at and really be clear that, again, survivors look any different way. There's not one cookie cutter way survivors look. But if a TVA has figured out through communication, through talking with someone, that maybe someone who's a co-defendant or someone who's been identified as a survivor but is actually the partner choosing to use abusive behavior. Sometimes that happens. We know that happens. So again, the TVA can have some discretion around maybe sharing a little less information, or maybe they're, you know, again, part of that skill set is learning about screening, learning about, you know, what to listen for, because we know we really want to listen for behaviors within context. Context is everything in domestic violence, right? So again, just recognizing that that's a piece that a TVA has to kind of make that judgment call around, maybe we're not, you know, delving into too many pieces here if they've been able to figure out this doesn't seem to be the right constellation, or this person doesn't seem to really be a identified survivor in this situation. Again, it doesn't mean that they won't talk to them, but maybe they will give them a little less information, or try to figure out what kinds of what kinds of dynamics are happening. So again, it's important just to put that out there. And I see in the chat question about the PowerPoint. Yes, so I will send out later this week a copy of the PowerPoint along with the recording, as well as there will be a survey, which I would appreciate for you all to fill out. So moving on. So I'm not going to go into all of the nuance of treatment victim advocates and their training, okay? Ultimately, there's a lot of details specified in 7.0, but it's important just to know that those pieces were put into place really to elevate the treatment victim advocacy role and substantiate their, you know, their skills, and really as an equal partner in the NTT. So as I mentioned earlier, TVAs are not in any statute, and they also currently don't have a central place in terms of oversight or support, or, you know, to get training and technical assistance specifically. They can reach out to the Domestic Violence Offender Management Board, even the Victim Advocacy Committee within the board. There's lots of options, but not lots of options. There are some options within the DVOMB for treatment victim advocates to reach out to ask questions, usually specific questions, but they don't have a central governing or supportive kind of oversight or anything like that. So ultimately, because of that, the 7.0 training requirements were put into place to really make sure that TVAs have the skills, can have that background in order to do this kind of delicate work. So they might have, they can get a certification through COVA, the Colorado Organization of Victim Assistance, or NOVA, the national version of that. They don't have to attend COVA or NOVA training specifically. It's more about getting those hours and being either at the entry level or the fully qualified level. So there's two levels. And again, in 7.0, it outlines all of the different treatment training areas, all of the different specifics of hours and whatnot, because there's training and there's also experiential hours. Again, those were put into place as a goal to kind of uplift TVAs a little bit more and make sure that they have all of the experience and knowledge that we're asking them to use in this very important role. So other things that are best practices. So we think about, looking at what TVAs do, and it's important for them to be familiar with the communities that they're working in. So having like local, regional, statewide, and national resources for survivors, or knowing where to look for those, that's very important, as well as just overall knowledge of the standards, right? So we don't think that anybody, even treatment providers, are going to memorize all of the things in the standards. It's just important to know where the things are and how to find them, right? When we have questions. So same thing for treatment victim advocates. Important for them to understand not just 7.0, but the other parts of the standards. And again, that's where the DVOMB does come into play around their trainings, and I'm going to plug those again. So other responsibilities to think about is, it's really, again, best practice for TVAs and the treatment provider that they're working with to have regular communication. Again, that doesn't mean that everything the TVA knows about a survivor is shared with the treatment provider. Absolutely not. It just depends upon what the survivor's choices are with that. However, it's important that TVAs and treatment providers are definitely in communication and trying to make sure that, if there's, again, any issues coming up, if there's progress being made that can be shared, or the opposite, if there's any kind of risk change that, we need some more safety planning around. It's all important, and that relationship is very important. And I mentioned, participation in MTTs earlier, but also important to notice, again, MTTs look different in every community. It's not just, rural looks one way and urban looks another way. They can all be different. Some are going to be like community meetings that have, that maybe they talk about multiple offenders at, once a month at a meeting. Sometimes it might just be, maybe it's just the offender treatment provider, the TVA, and maybe probation, just having a quick phone call just about one offender. And that's an MTT meeting. So there's not one way that MTT meetings have to look. So it's really important to recognize that too. Also important to know that, as I mentioned earlier, TVAs might have, maybe they have multiple jobs. Maybe they're not able to, participate as directly in an MTT meeting. So there's some different problem solving and things to think about in terms of that. And actually, on the DVOMB website, there is a document that talks about including the TVA in the MTT process. And so there's some best practices in that too. So there's a link to that document at the end of the resources as well. So I just want to put that on your radar. If that's something that you're noticing that is coming up as a struggle within treatment provision, within the MTTs, if you're like, hey, we can never get the TVA to come or to participate, how else can we do it? That is the go-to document. That is the place to start, and really making sure TVAs are included in understanding what meetings are going to take place. Is there a way they can kind of share that information either by proxy or ahead of time? Really thinking through some of these pieces. So in terms of another piece about best practices for TVAs is being really clear about their role, right? Just like with other advocates, being able to explain their role. And also, again, being able to explain their role to survivors and the different similarities and differences that come up with all the different types of advocates that a survivor might encounter. So back when I was talking about the 3 types of advocates, when you think about what that, that there are 3 different kinds, a survivor might encounter all 3. And depending upon the timeline, they could interact with 3 at once, in theory. That would be, super confusing and a lot. And also really important why it's important for people to be able to, advocates as well as other folks who are in the MTT or part of the offender treatment process, to be able to understand and explain what does each type of advocate do? What services can they provide? What does their confidentiality look like? Because again, important to remember, especially when survivors are, experiencing trauma and trying to figure out how a process works for a new, in a new moment, there's usually going to be some repetition needed. And Gail's question in the chat about victim contact information is coming up. Right now. So connecting survivors with TVAs. So this slide, I guarantee, is going to make some people frustrated. Okay, that's not why I created it. And some of it might seem clear as mud, but I just want to be honest. It's not necessarily the smoothest process in the world, but it's important to kind of break it down. So really want to put this out here. Definitely invite questions, okay? And I'm looking at time, and we're towards the end, and I want to make sure that if you have questions, feel free to type those in the chat and we'll get to them. So when we think about, ultimately treatment victim advocates tend to get their information from the treatment provider, because again, treatment victim advocacy happens because an offender has come into contact with a treatment provider. Maybe they're doing an evaluation, they want to enter treatment, whatever that process looks like. So that's where the TVA usually gets their primary information. However, a lot of times, not all the time, but a lot of times it can be older information. So for example, maybe that information to contact a survivor comes from a police report, but the survivor maybe has moved or changed their phone number or any number of things. So again, that's usually the initial piece. And one part I really want to highlight about this in offender treatment, I know the offender treatment providers know this, but other folks might not be as clear, but in offender treatment, so offenders do need to sign a release in order for the treatment provider to share information to that treatment victim advocate, who ultimately could share that information with the survivor if the survivor chooses. But there is never, ever, ever a requirement for offenders to be responsible for giving victim contact information. That's a huge safety issue. So there's no requirement that an offender has to know or give accurate information about survivor contact info. So just want to put that out there. That's very important. So we don't rely on offenders to give that information. Again, sometimes they have it because of other circumstances happening. Maybe they're still cohabitating. Again, any number of situations can be there, but just important to know that it's never a requirement. So again, TVAs might start with some information and might be old. So they might need to do some kind of tracking down work. So a couple options. They might be able to contact, if they know who the offender, who their probation officer or parole officer is, contact the victim service officer, contact the VSO within that department and say, hey, can you pass along to survivor so-and-so my contact information as a TVA? So again, that doesn't seem super direct, but that is currently how things are written judicially. So in terms of, not being able to call up the VSO and saying, hey, will you give me this survivor contact information? It's asking the VSO to say, hey, will you pass this along to this survivor? Because again, they don't know if they have contact with that survivor either. And let them know I'm the TVA. If they want to contact me, here's my contact information. So that's one way. Also important to think about survivors. So if a survivor is trying to figure out, like, how do I find out anything about offender treatment? I'm not sure. If they happen to know somehow, and again, this information might come in a variety of ways. If they happen to know what offender treatment program an offender is going to, they can call that directly and say, hey, can I have the TVA call me? Here's my contact information. Or if they happen to know maybe who the, which probation parole department that an offender is affiliated with, contacting the VSO there to say, hey, I want to find out, how to learn more about offender treatment. Again, important to recognize that most survivors aren't going to know to ask for a treatment victim advocate. That's an advocate they probably haven't encountered yet. So, if they're asking questions like, how do I learn about offender treatment? That's kind of the red flag of like, oh, we need to connect them with the TVA. Again, recognizing that this isn't the smoothest system, but we're trying to figure out how do we, fill in some of those gaps. So when we all know all of these pieces, it can be more helpful to try to track things down. So if a system-based advocate who's not in probation or parole, for example, if they want to contact a TVA and they happen to know the probation or parole department that an offender is affiliated with, maybe it's a violation of protection order case, for example, or something like that. Maybe a system-based advocate's trying to track down a TVA to say, hey, I want to share this information, or I want to make sure that you know this. Again, TVA could receive information. They just can't say whether or not they're going to tell the survivor if they've had any contact with the survivor unless they have a release. But if a system-based advocate wants to try to go that route, they can try to contact the VSO and say, hey, do you have any TVA information? I want to try to contact this person. Same thing, if a system-based advocate happens to know who the treatment provider is, then they can try to say, hey, calling the treatment provider office, can I have TVA information? So it's, like I said, it can feel complicated, it can feel indirect, and recognizing there's these different layers of making sure that survivors get choices about whose information is, who's accessing their information. In some ways, recognizing that it can be challenging and that hopefully there's a way to problem solve it. Also at the bottom here, community-based advocates, they would only contact a TVA or try to get TVA contact information if a survivor had signed a very specific, time-limited, voluntary written release that they were trying to, figure things out. So maybe a community-based advocate might, if they had any information, or try to maybe contact a systems advocate to say, hey, do you have any information? Kind of going that route, but only if the survivor, for some reason, wasn't willing to or able to do that themselves, and with a specific release. So there's not some magical, database of survivor information just living there in the universe where people can go access it and say like, oh, I won't tell anyone. So there's this protection level, and again, I want to recognize that it can be a little frustrating and confusing. So this is a big one. I want to pause here because I know that this I'm actually towards the end, and recognize we have about 8 minutes left. I want to know, do you have any questions for me, or is there a specific slide that that you would like to go back and see? Let's see. All right. You know, I mentioned earlier that, you know, when treatment victim advocates have questions, they don't have a oversight or you know, a common contact place that they can contact the DVOMB, you know, ask questions, kind of maybe talk through something. And in the past, I have, you know, offered to be a resource. I can't guarantee that I can answer every single question under the sun, but my contact information is also here in the presentation, and I don't mind if people, and it doesn't have to be a TVA. Sometimes other folks might ask questions too. I've done presentations for probation departments in the past. I've presented at the DVSO conference about TVAs. I don't mind talking about them, so I can make sure that you all know that it's absolutely okay to use me as a resource. It is just not like a central part of what I do right now, but that if you have a question, I'm happy to try to answer it. So as I'm going to keep an eye on the chat box and see if more questions pop up. And here's the DVOMB website. Again, you're going to get the PowerPoint, so that way you can look up some of these documents, look up their website. There's more documents on the website. And this is just kind of an example, some of my 3 faves. And I also include, you know, I love the National Network to End Domestic Violence. They have a lot of great confidentiality tools and technology support tools with their safety net project. So I like to include this link in a lot of presentations, just so that they can, that folks know that they're out there. And then also, here is my contact information. And I also would like to put, this is I'm putting in the chat box the survey link, which will also go out in a follow-up email. And so let's see. In terms of, we have a question about the recording. So yes, this week the recording will go out along with the PowerPoint and along with the survey link. So any other questions? Okay, oh, I missed one. Sorry about that. Looks like Claudia. Thank you, Claudia. When communicating with a treatment agency, they can give a TVA, but we cannot always give them info on a survivor unless the survivor signs an ROI. Correct. So I guess I'm confused about who's communicating with whom. So my apologies, Claudia. So if someone is contacting the treatment victim treatment agency, the offender treatment provider, and they're looking for you know, a TV, you know, they're looking for TVA contact information maybe to share with the survivor. You're not. I'm going to guess this is me going on a limb here. I'm guessing, Claudia, maybe you're with probation, parole, or community corrections. So again, my apologies for making this assumption, but you're a victim advocate. Victim advocate, are you a system advocate or community-based? Guessing system. Community-based. Okay, so if you're a community-based advocate and you are trying to help a survivor contact a treatment victim advocate, okay, thank you, Claudia. So Claudia has mentioned being a community-based victim advocate, but is also in the role of a TVA. So as I mentioned earlier, that can be kind of a tricky place. So ultimately, you know, when someone is doing community-based advocacy work, that's one lane. Because as I mentioned earlier, community-based advocates have statute-defined confidentiality and privilege. TVAs do not have that. So that's why when someone is a TVA affiliated with a community-based program, they really have to keep those roles separate. So that way then it doesn't impact potentially any federal funding for a community-based program because of the differences in confidentiality. So that might sound like a whole big other can of worms, and you have my contact information, but in terms of anybody sharing information about a survivor, you have to have a release. So let's just, like, that's a blanket. You need an ROI in order to share any survivor information, unless you are a system advocate, like, for example, law enforcement or court-based advocate. You don't need a release to share information, with other folks in the system. So hopefully that's clear, and not clear as mud, but if other questions come up, definitely contact me, and I can always talk through a scenario. Ultimately, again, this is about figuring out what the role and being clear about what the role of a TVA is and how they fit into all of the different advocacy pieces, and knowing that they're offering this great service to survivors, right? Most of the time survivors might not really have any clue of, like, well, I know so-and-so's going to classes. That's a common thing we hear, right? But to learn more about that make sure that they understand that it's possible to, have a voice in the process if they want, and if that feels safe for them. So I'm looking at the time. I'm gonna make sure, okay, I don't see any other questions. I thank all of you for being present today, for asking questions. Maybe you're mulling over some other questions that you're not quite sure yet. Feel free to contact me if you do. And I really appreciate all of you being here with me and learning about TVAs. And my last plug will be definitely go to the DVOMB website, check out the standards. Not light reading material, but hey, if you have insomnia, it might help. But check out 7.0 because it really outlines the treatment victim advocacy stuff. So thank you all. And I'm going to